to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swindon Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, are politicians stupid, mistaken, or evil? A topic that raises its head in, well, libertarian circles and other circles, conservative circles, etc., which is, why is it the case that politicians almost always introduce policies which are just plainly terrible, particularly from the libertarian perspective, like economic policies, increased government spending, increased taxation, back in the day, the introduction of fiat money, etc. The question is, why is it the case that they enact such terrible policies? More of sort of like the mainstream classical liberal types who sort of populate the beltway think tanks, and think tanks, say, in the UK, like the Adam Smith Institute, for instance. I mean, not all, but most of them will have the idea that, well, all the politicians have the right, they've got the good intentions at heart, but they've just sort of enthralled to bad ideas. They're just merely mistaken. More radical libertarians types, and I think you could include, well, Rothbard would be included in here, mostly sort of see them as just self-interested primarily. I mean, that's the basis of Rothbard's sort of conspiracy theory of history essay, which is that, basically follow the money, who benefits, and primarily sees politicians and actors like that as just self-interested. And then you could sort of go in sort of the Alex Jones position, which is that politicians aren't just sort of, they're not mistaken, they're just evil. They have their own goals, which is to sort of enrich themselves at the expense of everybody else. And then you get the arguments that, are they part of some sort of international sort of satanic grouping? Are they part of some sort of pedo cult, etc., etc.? So these seem to be the three sort of broad positions that could be which could be the case with politicians. So the question is, well, which of these is true? Although I've actually admitted one so far, which is whether or not it's just because politicians are stupid, which would seem to be the most, as it were, innocuous of the reasons. But are they really that stupid? Tim, what do you reckon with respect to politicians and their cognitive abilities? Do you think politicians are relatively sort of intelligent in certain respects, or do you think that most of them are just a bit dumb, and so it's not unobvious why they enact poor policies because they just don't know what a good policy would look like?
I don't think they are unintelligent in the way that someone in an institution of old would be considered unintelligent or some like handicapped person, if such things exist. Some people, politically correct people, would say they don't exist, but I don't think they're in that way unintelligent. They could tie their shoes. They probably could do math problems of some degree if they think math exists and so forth. So in that regard, I don't think they're unintelligent. They also are probably socially competent insofar as they can go out and do, make friends. Most of these people are married or have some, or maybe to multiple women or multiple marriages at some point. But I don't think they're stupid. I think the way the stupid is just sort of a swear word thrown at them. I don't think. I think they are, in some ways, they're less capable than other people. Is it a fallback job? I don't know. It's unclear. I think great politicians historically are fairly capable people that probably could have been successful at other things, but chose to be a politician. So I don't think stupidity is in general is a way to do it. Maybe, do you have any further? That's probably the end of my comment there.
I don't think they're stupid. They may not be super bright or super sharp, but to get in the position of where they are, they've at least got to be sort of socially adept. they've got to butter the right people up. They've got to be able to cast off people when they need to. Given, of course, here that I'm assuming that the goal is to climb up to some sort of relatively senior office, which seems to be the goal of most politicians. I mean, even take someone like AOC. I mean, she's tempted to ride it by conservatives as stupid. She doesn't seem hugely stupid. She has sort of odd faux pas and things, and her policies are well far from. She's not stupid. She's not sort of like part of like the urban underclass, or some sort of rural redneck who sort of just lives on his in the trailer park and like drinks bud. I mean, I think the idea that politicians are stupid now, whether politicians are more stupid than they were historically is an interesting question. I mean, for instance, like Moldbug would argue that you kind of had like parliamentary democracy for a relatively short period where the politicians kind of made the decisions. And whereas now that's kind of been hived off to permanent bureaucracies and stuff, that the actual sort of true power lies elsewhere now. And so it's sort of less important to be there. So I think that's possibly true to some extent. I think if you look to, say, the British Parliament in, say, the 1950s and 60s, this could just be nostalgia. It is probably the case that the average intelligence level was higher. But, I mean, the current political class, at least in England, are far from stupid. So I think the response that politicians are somewhat stupid, which explains their significantly poor action, I don't really think explains it at all. So then the question is, well, if they're not stupid, then are they just mistaken? Well, the thing is, well, yes, of course they could be mistaken. They could think things are a good idea, and they end up being a bad idea. So they could think, well, what would be good for people would be to lock everybody in their houses to prevent people dying from a really, 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 really vicious virus, which is neither particularly vicious in the grand scheme of things, nor would that policy actually achieve the goal that they attempted to, well, at least claimed that they were attempting to achieve. So they are mistaken. That's true. But then the question is, well, to what extent are they responsible for being mistaken? I don't know the exact legal situation here, but I'm pretty sure that if you say you were to run a factory and you were an owner of a factory and you calibrated the machine in such a way, in an error, you thought it was the right way of doing it, but you did it wrong, and this led to the injury or death of one of your workers, you would then be considered negligent criminally and would probably be at least fined or possibly even jailed in certain circumstances. So on the sort of standard sort of criminal law about the average citizen, just being mistaken is not a defense, because the idea is, well, you should have known this, and therefore you were negligent in not knowing it, and therefore people have been suffered as a result of your negligence. So then the question is then, Tim, if politicians are enthralled to bad ideas, to what extent would you say that most politicians, obviously when we talk about politicians, we're talking about in general, not necessarily universally, do you think that they are negligent in things that they, ideas that they hold? Are they negligent? Are they sort of negligent in their sort of knowledge of economics and other areas, such that they are making errors, but they are culpable for them?
Well, I think this is where the minarchist-anarchist dispute comes out in full thrust here. A while back, David Friedman responded to Murray Rothbard. Murray Rothbard commented here, like, the problem with David Friedman is he doesn't hate the state with his gut. And David Friedman, I think, gave a good response. Now, I like both of them at this point. David Friedman, I thought, gave a good response. He said, I like to do my arguing with my head and use reason instead of viewing people as in that way. And this may lead in toward more so your third category, evil here. But I'm going to bring this point up with negligence here, because I think the state has a kind of privilege, so to speak, which I think Friedman said this is like, well, it's sort of just expected the state is allowed to do certain things and get away with it. That's the purpose of the state. Now, the minarchists or objectivists, I'd say, are some of the most honest statists out there, insofar as they'll define, like, of course the police are allowed to come and take your property back, give it back to the rightful owner. Now, as Hoppe would point out, this is sort of a contradiction in terms, a tax-paying, expropriating property protector. But the state has a privilege. It just sort of assumes the state is allowed to do certain things in an emergency, for example. So the state, so McIntyre, and I cannot find the quote that McIntyre says, but supposedly McIntyre, considering what the state is allowed to do, and considering that people in general assume it to be true. Now, that's not an argument necessarily, but people assume it's okay for the state to do it. Well, if people are going to go become politicians, well, people made that mistake before, so what's wrong with it? It's just sort of what we assume. So, like, David Friedman was just saying, like, people run for office because they think they can be better than the other guy, or they can be half decent. So if they're negligent, well, the state's always sort of had a sovereign, some sort of immunity. Now, of course, the qualified immunity issue has come up, but there's sort of sovereign immunity. There's various forms of immunity. Now, of course, interestingly, if the state gets occupied by another state, then you get the sort of like Nuremberg things like that come in. Like, but most philosophers of law would say, no, I shouldn't say that. In my view, Carl Schmitt's right about this. This is just basically it's complicated, but like if a foreign power invades you and sets up a court to try the people here, that's a sort of dicey situation here. So I'm unclear here. I think Michel Foucault is right that he critiqued Chomsky for saying you're interfering with justice by implying a higher form of justice which you cannot provide a basis for other than some like pure philosophy here. So like in that case, it was the Vietnam War was the issue at hand, and Foucault was basically saying, well, the state is thinking of itself as doing justly. So is it negligent? Well, it depends on what your definition of negligent is. In the factory owner example, the factory owner unfortunately is a private citizen. Now, if it's a government factory, like the government vaccine, then you're allowed to actually just get away with anything. It's just, which is, I think, is technically not allowed to sue it. You're not allowed to sue it there. So negligence, sure. But unfortunately, people allow the state to get away with more things than private citizens for whatever reason. That would be my long-worded response to your negligence question. I don't know if it's a good response, but that'd be my response.
Well, no, that does make sense. I mean, the state is allowed to be sort of, there is an asymmetry in the way it's treated legally. That's true. But I suppose even if my argument doesn't extend to sort of like prosecuting politicians, although I'm far from opposed to that necessarily, it's sort of like an analogous negligence. I mean, it's clear that unlike private actors, even if you're owning like a firm or your actions that you engage in, I mean, they have impact on other people indirectly, but it's not as if you're changing the rules of the game. I mean, when it comes to policy and law, that is changing the rules of the game, and thereby it directly affects other people. And if you're going to be engaged in something which directly affects other people, and by direct, I mean, it means that their taxes go up. It means what they were doing was legal now is illegal, or vice versa. You should be pretty darn sure that what you're doing is kind of a good idea. I mean, you can make the case that some politicians vote for something because it's the least bad option, and you can make some sort of consequentialist utilitarian defense of them. But I mean, maybe it's my area and so I'm monomaniacal on it. But I mean, the the understanding of economics is so shallow, and you just get just terrible terrible sort of policy, and people just think he's great. I mean, maybe they're just defending their party, but they genuinely would even recognize what a good policy. I mean, related. I mean, what was the Austrian alternative to stimulus? Well, the problem with the question is you need to understand that what is growth, what causes growth, and why should we even care about growth? I severely doubt any major politician has even considered that question, because that would then just sort of filters into what the kind of policy decisions would actually help to achieve that, assuming, of course, that growth is good. Why should we care about it? But it just seems to be on a whole host of things that they just are negligent. I mean, it just seems obviously the case that they are mostly negligent on things. Now, you could say, well, it's just because I disagree with them. But I mean, if I was to name loads of different sort of disputes or whatever, pertaining to economics particularly, would they even know what the disputes were or who was on either side? I severely doubt it. Because I think really, if we sort of just move on slightly, I think it's the case with politicians is that they're mistaken because they don't really care about being right, because what they effectively are, I think, in most cases, is pretty much just self-interested. Where insofar as, well, what's the goal of being in politics? Well, the goal of being in politics is to climb the greasy pole to get more power, as more power than you had before and as much as you possibly can. I mean, that pretty much seems to explain their behavior. Why did they support certain policies? Well, because they think it's popular. Why do they care about being popular? Well, because they can get re-elected and they can keep their salary and they can keep their power. Why do they advocate for certain policies? Well, because they're getting campaign donations from organizations which will be benefited from the policy that's been introduced. It seems pretty clear, I think, that politicians aren't merely mistaken. I think in principle, they could even know what the quote unquote the right thing to do is. But since it's not in their interest to do so, then they don't do it. I mean, Ron Paul, for instance, would be a good counterexample to this. But the number of sort of Ron Paul-esque politicians is, minimal. But then the question is, I mean, this is sort of the asymmetry you're talking about legally, is, well, if politicians are just self-interested, and that self-interest extends basically to, at least in part, taking more stuff from other people, I mean, to what extent are politicians basically like thieves or just common criminals? I mean, so for instance, if someone burgles a house, in most cases, they don't have any particular animosity towards the owners. They don't particularly care. They don't particularly just want to harm them particularly. They just want their stuff. But that's kind of a criminal action, because it's not because you used to have a sufficient disregard for the well-being of somebody else, even if you're not actively seeking to sort of harm it. And so it kind of seems that, oh, okay, we're supposing just self-interested. Well, if they're self-interested, in many cases, although not all, it would seem to me that their sort of self-interest is effectively similar to that of a regular common criminal. Tim, any comments?
Oh, I would entirely agree that that we've made the joke before. A group of criminals is called a gang. A very well group is called a state. I entirely agree. But the trouble is, no one else, only a minority of people and thinkers see it that way, and a fairly large, coherent majority see it the other way, or are currently persuaded. And even most conservatives aren't anarchists, much to the chagrin of Hoppe. So the sort of, are they like common criminals? Well, this becomes, I would say, usage of word problems by definition. in the current language, a criminal is a member of the state can't by definition be a criminal unless that state collapses. So interestingly, like Jefferson Davis was in prison. He was one of the few Confederates after the Civil War that was they imprisoned him for 2 years. They eventually pardoned him, but before he eventually got away. I think he moved to Quebec for a while. Quebec's part of that time British Canada. So like in a way, it is interesting. I just don't think by definition they can be considered. They have that legal privilege, and it's sort of like prosecuting. I mean, in reverse, to be fair, like take Derek Chauvin. I've heard your roundtable with Keith Preston and Todd Lewis on him. In a reverse way, I think going out and going after every low-beat cop or low-beat German soldier or American soldier or British soldier or French soldier or Chinese soldier or Japanese soldier will be kind of silly as well. So yeah, I just don't think politicians, like legislators, can do it. Now, my guess is skin in the game matters a lot too. This is Nassim Taleb's argument here, where like most Roman empires, for all their faults, would die by assassination. Now, whether that's statistically true is of some question. Some historians might push back against that claim. I'm just sort of going to take this on authority that Nassim Taleb knows what he's talking about. That like dictators generally die like drug lords. Like no one remains at the kingpin for long, maybe 5-10 years, but then you run out of networks and then it just collapses. So in that regard, maybe there's more in common with drug pins, Boris Johnson and Jefferson Davis than one wants to admit. But again, we're in an intellectual minority here. Most people seem to be okay with that privilege, at least in general. Maybe in particular instances they aren't, but in general they're okay with the sort of privilege that's allowed. So by language, they are like it, but no one else sees it that way.
I think the purpose, one of the benefits of looking at it this way is it seems to be the case that politicians sort of, they're just self-interest, just trying to climb the greasy pole. And I think that if you just look at it and go, well, they are actually directly harming people, even if they're not intending to. I mean, analogously, it's the same. I mean, they might want to make some other sort of defense of them. Well, they're doing what they think is the best, and then you can go on to, to what extent they are culpable in not knowing things that they should have known, as we discussed before, or whatever. But whilst it is true, I think people would respond in that way. I do think at least pointing out to people that, for instance, even if you said to someone, well, taxation should exist, and we need some state provision of things. If you said, well, okay, imagine a case where a politician votes for even higher taxes over and above the optimal level, which would be bad because it's in his self-interest. I mean, does this not seem similar to a common criminal in certain respects? Well, I think yes. And I think you can even get people to think it, recognize it to be like that. It's just a question would regard, well, what actually constitutes criminal behavior. And then you probably at some point going to get to the asymmetry of what the state can do and what the individual can do. But if you get people to see beyond what they think is reasonable for the sort of the state to do, I think you might get some headway there, but I might not. I mean, I don't remember ever trying this on any sort of statist.
Interestingly, at this point, many people don't regard common criminals as evil. They just view them as victims of circumstances. So there's a certain degree, well, they just had bad childhoods, or there's not enough welfare, or there's not enough social programs, or they, various other things. So interestingly, that part of your claim, now I might regard it that way. Certain people might regard it that way. But it seems like increasingly the opposite is true. Although here in the United States, we've seen certain mayors of cities start to There's a politician in Philly who got car hijacked, who was this is hilarious. I saw this locally, went sort of viral locally because she had a bunch of tweets about various causes about a year ago, and now she's got armed carjacked in Philly in broad daylight. So I think that's again we can. I think there's a certain degree in which, in this regard, the older view is probably more correct here. But even on that claim, today, some people probably don't even agree with that. That would be my quick point. Sorry for interrupting.
But even if they do, in a way, the politician is worse. Because is the politician generally a victim of poor upbringing? I mean, unlikely. I mean, the backgrounds of most politicians are relatively middle class, or at least upper working at worst. And in most cases, probably upper middle. So that's kind of unlikely. In a way, you can easily apply agency to the politician that some people may withhold from the common criminal.
That's entirely true. They could be doing something else. They could be painting houses. They could be, being ministers or whatever. But instead, they're working for the government. That's a very interesting point. Sorry for interrupting there.
No, that's good. So I do think politicians, and again, I mean, as an aside, I'm saying this is politicians. You could extend this analysis to high-level government functionaries in general, people who are members of the permanent bureaucracies, because as Moldbug has pointed out, and sort of James Lawrence, go back to Burnham, really, this is sort of where most of the sort of power and decision making takes place. To a large extent, I'm focusing on politicians as such, but they're sort of like the front of the fun and games. They're part of the spectacle. They're not sort of necessarily behind the spectacle as such. I
just quick. Sorry for keeping interrupting. And this makes them further culpable. They'll take credit for policies, like they don't deny credit. Like they'll take credit. They'll go be in the parade. Now they might run if it goes bad, but so they'll take credit for the actions too, which makes them further culpable in my mind. I think you would agree.
Oh yeah. They take credit for anything that they didn't do, or anything that goes well is to do with them. Anything that does badly with somebody else. It's always the case. So it does seem to be the case. I mean, not all politicians and not all sort of civil servants. I'm not sure what you call them in the States. The sort of government bureaucrats. Not all sort of self-interested in an overt sense necessarily, but it's pretty sure that if you're going to go for one explanation, it's the one that kind of explains a lot of the behavior more than anything else. I mean, if you think that they're just sort of idealistic, I mean, well, they're just negligent. Well, and again, just in inverted commas, negligent, because they really ought to know better, given the fact that they've got hold of basically a very powerful weapon. I mean, it'd be like the advocates of a gun control. You're in control of something very powerful. You need to make sure you're up to the task of doing it. I mean, surely you should apply the same thing to politicians. So I think that is at least almost is true in many, if not all cases. Now we get to probably more interesting questions, which is, are politicians sort of overtly evil? Now, when thinking about it, I kind of make the idea of like malevolently evil. So you could say the common criminal is evil insofar as he doesn't care about the harm he's imposing on somebody else. But here I'm talking about, do they do things to people because they want them to suffer injury? So for instance, the man who kills his brother because he marries the woman he should have married. The goal is not only to make himself better off in a way, but also to deliberately harm somebody else. Do politicians engage in actions which are basically vindictive and are done to sort of deliberately harm other people. So, for instance, in England, for instance, there was the Communications Act in 2003. I think the term is like, oh no, you can be criminally culpable if there's like grossly offensive messaging. Yes, that's the one. Grossly offensive messaging. And so the question is, well, was the Malicious Communications Act created so that they was it created to basically punish heretics? So as ever with this sort of thing, there was a woman called, I can't pronounce it, I think she was Chabloz, who was basically advocating sort of, shall we say, Holocaust revisionism. But this is so apparently grossly offensive that she needed to be imprisoned for it. So the question is, do politicians deliberately enact these sorts of actions so that they can punish people over and above what an individual would be legally allowed to do? I mean, they wouldn't necessarily punish them, they socially ostracize or impose harm on them. I mean, do they deliberately engage in these sorts of actions to harm people? I mean, that would be an interesting question. And then related to that, although this isn't necessarily imposing harm a little bit on people, but is it the case that that politicians and high-level government functionaries, do they involve themselves in sort of like, are there a lot of them involved in like overtly, obviously, quote unquote, evil activity? So, I mean, you get, this is where you get sort of the international sort of child sex ring arguments amongst government functionaries, and the stuff relating to Epstein, although the stuff Epstein was dealing with seems to be sort of like standards of blackmail and relatively young girls, but not that young. So there's a grab bag of a few things. So do you think, so for one thing, that some politicians do go out of their way to deliberately to try and punish certain groups and deliberately sort of impose harm upon them? And to what extent do you think it's possible that the government functionaries are engaged in what regular people will go as, well, yeah, that's just kind of evil? Now, obviously, you can get the argument, are they just mistaken? Are they just ignorant, etc.? But just in the general use of the term evil activity, do you think that is something that many or few, is that sort of rife in those sort of circles, or is that just a creation of the minds of people who want to sort of impose the malevolence in the world onto certain people and sort of create narratives to sort of explain it?
I could go many ways with this answer here. I think I'll go full Zizek/Chesterton here on this answer. I think on one level, I could just go full Rene Girard. On one level, politicians' political order is implied on going out and punishing some group. That's what the state in practice does. Different states will punish different groups here. In a way, a clean state might be a nightmare, in the sense that, Rothbard says corruption is a good thing. I think Rothbard said that, because then you can sort of get away with things. But a clean state might be a nightmare, because then everything, or maybe it wouldn't be. So are they evil? Again, this hinges a lot on the sort of definition and usage of words here. So there's sort of different levels here. As I've stated, certain historical boogeymen you're allowed to throw that at, and fairly or unfairly you can. Whether you can throw that at current politicians is of some question. It's entirely I can't even answer this question, because the word evil has so many different meanings here.
All I was meaning by evil is just what people would generally consider evil. So if you had like the child rapist or the child murderer, are they evil in that sort of colloquial sense in which people typically use the word, or as well as that they, as I said, that they deliberately go after a particular to deliberately harm them? And I suppose the assumption here is that they're in fact sort of, well, I suppose this is where they would disagree, that they are innocent in a certain sense.
Yes, but I think that goes back to my second answer, the difference between private public actors, in the sense that I don't think they exist. I'm very sympathetic to the Amish position about, I, for example, did not vote in the last election, partly because I was away, but partly because I didn't really care. It wasn't a major election here, and partly because I was sort of annoyed that, like, Jeffrey Tucker is entirely correct that Mr. Donald is a lot more pro the war on COVID than many people on the left paint him to be. He's not like Hoover insofar as Hoover is viewed as a do nothing, but actually Hoover did a lot. Same way with Trump on the war on COVID. He did do a lot for worse, in my opinion. He's triple vaccinated, by the way, and supports Pfizer. But anyway, that point aside, I'm very sympathetic to the Amish position of just not voting, and by extension not being involved in politics due to the corrupting nature. That's the sort of Lord Acton view. But again, that sort of poses a problem of, like, if you think a state is necessary, how do you have social order? Well, then again, I don't know if a state is necessary. And if it is necessary, I'm not going to be a part of it. I think that's one of the problems that Ron Paul. So actually, Hoppe was once critical of Ron Paul. And he was sort of like, be careful about getting too much about the Masseys and the Ron Paul. As good as Massey or Ron Paul is, you should be careful in a way. So are politicians evil? Again, I think my second distinction there, like, as far as the common person just murders his brother, or I don't know, this sort of common murder here, are they like them? No, just by definition, usually they aren't like them. But people like politicians, and actually I like the old word campaign. Campaign is an interesting word that's from military history. You're going to go out on the campaign trail. Well, you can go out and campaign against the Saxons, or campaign against the French, or campaign against the Ottomans, or campaign against the Babylonians. Well, in a way, you're going after a certain group to acquire assets and resources, and to punish and go kill the enemies, so to speak. So in a way, campaign by definition is a kind of looting party. I mean, this is the problem that libertarian politicians have insofar as they don't have anything to give. They don't have they don't have any benefits to give. The socialists can say, we're going to give this group of people new TVs or new things, and we're going to take this from this other group that's slightly more helpless. Now, again, whether Ayn Rand is like the big business or the most exploited group in the world, it tends to be the big businessmen are the ones doing or technically behind the looting, using the other people as fronts. That's my technical analysis here. I think you'd probably agree with that claim, but it's a very complicated issue here. In a way, I think to some extent everyone's unless you sort of totally absolve yourself from the state, which is hard to do. In a way, everyone is guilty. As far as common people, how they view it, I'd say they're incoherent and schizophrenic. I think that's the common answer you've given me. So I'd say the common view is it's sort of incoherent and schizophrenic. Would that be my? Sorry for I don't know if I answered the question here. That'd be about as close of an answer I could give.
Well, no, I think that's I think that's interesting. What I was going to say was, I think sort of like punishing the heretic, and so for instance, was the Malicious Communication Act deliberately created so that they could go after heretics, like quote unquote the racist, the anti-Semite, etc., etc. Well, I think that's possibly true, but then that brings the whole sort of problem is that, well, they don't consider them innocent; they are evil, and therefore need to be punished. And so this sort of, in a way, is an issue overall for sort of like the state as such, which is, well, they are sort of to punish the evildoer and reward the good, but that presupposes that they know what the good is and what the bad is, and so you could argue it's a sort of a difference on there. So you can probably then you kind of get to high levels of ignorance as well, and then that goes back to the negligence point. Is the child laws really genuinely evil and creating malicious, vastly sort of obscene messages or something like that? I mean, so I think that kind of gets into taboos, etc. Although I do think the case that the state is imposing itself into areas where it previously wasn't doing, or at least hasn't done for a long time, and extending itself. And it also does seem to be the case as well, at least from Tony Blair onwards, that Tony Blair intended to impose, well, depends on if you say it's harm, because there's a quote from one of his advisors, a guy called Andrew Neither, who said that the immigration policy pursued by the Blair government in the late 90s was to rub the right's nose in diversity. So they were effectively attempting to impose harm, in a sense, although the question, although then they could say, well, it's not really harm, you think it is. So I think that's very much more of like a definitional sort of conceptual issue as well. I'd be remiss just to mention a few of the things with like evil, though, in general. I mean, you get sort of like the Bohemian Grove thing. So like Alex Jones going to see Bohemian Grove, and there's that big sort of theatrical performance of sacrificing a child to Moloch. Are the elites sort of involved in that? I mean, it's not obvious, whether that was a genuine sort of thing or was it just a LARPing exercise. And then, of course, you get all the other sort of things related to that. So the weird Podesta emails from a few years ago with quote unquote spirit cooking, which is weird, at least to some extent. And then there's the paintings that Podesta has on his wall of like children being sort of like looking frightened. And there's lots of them in not huge amounts of clothes. And when I say children, I mean like they're not like 15. They're like 10 or something like that. It's not a good look, put it that way, mildly. And then, of course, you get, like, historically, there's things like, I had to read the Franklin child prostitution ring allegations, which are apparently found to be baseless, but whether they were, I don't know. In 1988, authorities looked into allegations that prominent citizens in Nebraska, as well as high-level U.S. politicians, were involved in the child prostitution ring. There's also the claims from Marc Dutroux, who was a Belgian serial killer and rapist, that actually he was sort of, he was providing children to very high-ranking politicians and government functionaries. According to some commenters on this, it sounds a bit weird with Dutroux. Now, they always claim that he was just making stuff up, but apparently he wasn't very smart. He doesn't have a job. He had 5 houses and villas, and his wife and the guy that worked with him said that the girls were ordered, and it seems weird. I mean, apparently some key witnesses were killed at the time of the trial. It all seems strange. Now, whether that has explicable explanations, I don't know, but it is of any of the more recent cases with actual evidence. Well, potential evidence, it seems more like there's something there. Obviously, well, all the sex allegations are always very easy to make up, and very difficult to prove. So I'm always sort of dubious of that, because I don't get rape allegations. It's like, oh, who was it recently? It was Joan Collins, who said, oh yes, her husband raped her on their first date. Her first husband. Oh, okay, then you married him. I'm pretty sure it wasn't rape. And so you can make stuff up like that quite easily. So whether it's true, I don't know. But then the interesting question is, are politicians psychopathic? According to some research by a guy called Hare, David Hare, Robert Hare, was a Canadian psychologist in the 1980s. He came with a list of sort of lists of who would constitute a psychopath under various categories. So he has, are they superficial, grandiose, deceitful? Do they lack empathy? Don't accept responsibility? Do they have a lack of remorse? All of those in what we'll call the factor ones, they kind of fit in with basically narcissism. And then the factor 2 stuff is, are they impulsive? Do they have poor behavioral control? Lack goals? Are they irresponsible? Do they have adolescent antisocial behavior? Do they have adult antisocial behavior? And if you put these two together and you have enough on there, you get a psychopath. Now, politicians seem to be more prevalent in the first section, the factor 1s, which is like narcissism more than anything else. But it is interesting that he, with some of his research, says that psychopathy in the population was around 1%, if not lower, about 0.5%. But there's the estimate that CEOs and business executives is about 4%. And the sort of personality profile of like top CEOs and sort of politicians seems to be somewhat similar. So whether this means that all politicians are psychopaths, no, it doesn't. Does it mean that there's probably a greater proportion of them? Yes. And if they are, would they be more likely to engage in sort of what you could refer to as evil behavior? Possibly. I mean, certainly the sort of psychopathic stuff would explain the, not the malevolently evil stuff, but like the pure self-interest stuff and being completely disregarding of the overall effects. I think that would certainly be true. So, Tim, what do you think about the sort of more conspiratorial allegations about politicians and government functionaries, and do you think that politicians are psychopaths?
As far as the conspiracy is concerned, I agree with Tim Dillon, who was just recently on the Lex Friedman show. Sometimes these just become the news. This is where David Friedman is actually wrong, and Rothbard is right. I agree with Tim Dillon here that some of these things, he was recently on the Lex Friedman show, that some of these things just become the news. As far as conspiracy theories are concerned, this is very much contra David Friedman. You know, you sometimes do have to argue with your belly, so to speak, not your head, that these people are just out it for base desires, so to speak. I think the sort of pedophilia accusations would be considered a base desire. I think Aquinas would probably agree with that. Not a good look, so to speak. Whether they are true and can be substantiated is of some question. I think it's a danger, as Lex Friedman just pointed out, to always see these things, then you sort of get the opposite problem too. As far as the psychology point is concerned, I remain suspicious of psychology in general because of the exception. I'm not so suspicious of Freud. I think his Civilization Discontent's essay is outstanding, but empirical psychology I'm very suspicious of. But it is interesting that they might have a higher rating here. What counts as sociability, what counts as empathy, and what counts as these things. Partly because I might end up on one of these lists, or at least partly on these lists here. So I'm very sympathetic. It's sort of there are other episode we did on whether people are good, bad, or evil. I think Socrates basically thinks that the goal is to live in harmony here, and I just think this is one area in which it doesn't seem technically possible with humans as constructed as they are, or a certain percentage of humans as they constructed as they are in a scarce world. Now, whether the scarcity would solve it all is of some question here, but I'm going off of sort of deeper waters here. So I'm suspicious of the psychologists who make these claims here, and their sort of repeatability and various other manners. But on the conspiracy point, I would agree. They just become the news.
I think it depends how you think. It depends what you constitute a psychopath. But I do think it would certainly make sense for basically, well, I suppose most people who end up in highly competitive, highly powered jobs would likely be psychopathic in certain respects, because otherwise they wouldn't have got where they needed to be. They wouldn't have like climbed over somebody when they could have done, because if someone else would have done, they would have got to the top. Now, of course, you could imagine a situation in which that kind of behavior is not rewarded and punished, but that seems not to be the case.
I'm just going to quick respond. To be fair, though, in certain cases, that behavior, if directed correctly, is virtuous. I think you forwarded me a video of some absurd thing that German school students were had to do, and I said if you direct those people to a good action, they would do that good action to the highest level. So like discipline, if you have discipline, you could be, like this sort of like a motivational speaker 101 type thing. So I'm, like even politicians who are evil, they are interesting because I think they are disciplined to get where they are. They have to keep their mouths shut when they need to and so forth. So a lot of their skills are virtuous in the McIntyre sense. They're virtuous in themselves. Now maybe they're directed to abort a bad goal, and maybe that's by design. But I think in there is some virtue there. To climb an organization. Now maybe the goalie shouldn't do it. And this is Hayek's argument in why the worst get on top in the Road to Serfdom here. That by definition the selection effect is terrible. It's like a mafia organization. You have to kill someone to get there. That's true. I agree. But people just don't view the state that way. So that on that level it doesn't show up. But sorry for interrupting there.
No. I think that's true. That gets back to the earlier point. It shows that the politicians aren't stupid. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to have these goals to achieve and be calculating to get.
Here's a question for you, Swithin. Would you hire, if you were running a restaurant, would you hire Fauci or Boris Johnson to run the bookkeeping department, or let's say as a waiter? I think the answer is obviously yes. They pass the minimum standard of I would hire him as a taxi driver. I wouldn't have any problem.
I'd hire Fauci. Boris Johnson is completely inept. He's not stupid. He's lazy. He's really lazy, and can't make decisions at all. There was a story I read recently about how he just couldn't decide on how to lay out the front of a newspaper he was editing. A magazine he was editing. I'd choose Fauci every time. Fauci is significantly more capable. Now, Johnson is not stupid. That's not true. He just has character issues.
He'd be a good cab driver because he could cut corners and get you there quickly.
Yeah. Oh, cab driver. Yeah. He could be a cab driver. That'd be fine. Maybe as a waiter, he might be quite entertaining. He's doing quite well, but he might just not take the plates. I suppose he probably would. Fauci is competent in a technical sense, much more than Johnson is. I would say Johnson is very bluff, whereas Fauci knows when he's lying. I don't think Johnson does. He just does it out of habit. Now I could be wrong on that, but yeah, I'd be surprised if Johnson was so inept that he couldn't be a waiter. Put it that way. It might be true, but I think it's unlikely. But any final comments, Tim, as to whether politicians are evil? Stupid, evil, or mistaken?
No, this is a very interesting discussion. It sort of follows up on the first discussion, which was on Socrates and Aquinas and things and Plato's dialogue. So, very interesting idea, very interesting discussion. Thanks for having it.
Thank you for joining as ever. Now, I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. And please subscribe to us on YouTube and Podbean. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibityshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibityshow@gmail.com.